Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Crystal Fullerton, and I am the Farm Safety Coordinator with the PEI Federation of Agriculture. Together with a grant from PEI Workers' Compensation Board, we're proud to present to you our Building a Sustainable Farmer webinar series. I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Kim Hyndman Moffat from the Canadian Suicide Prevention Support Services. Kim is a crisis counselor with over 20 years experience aiding the farming community in their most stressful times. Kim grew up on a farm and has been a cattle producer, and her talk today is created just for farmers by a fellow farmer. Kim will look at the current influences and challenges facing farmers today and the impact on their mental health and well-being. We will gain skills to both recognize and respond to farmers who may be showing signs of distress and be in need of support. The issue of suicide in the farming community will also be addressed today, and participants will be given the basic tools to help connect farmers with the appropriate resources. A few housekeeping issues to introduce before we begin. Please mute during the duration of the webinar to ensure higher quality sound for everyone. We do have a chat and Q&A section. Please pay attention as there are boxes that you can check off to ask your questions anonymously. We encourage all dialogue because we want you to get as much as possible out of these webinars. Sometimes being anonymous will help questions pop up that others were too shy to ask. Kim is asking that you be patient as she wants to answer your questions after her presentation. But please feel free to type the questions in the chat or the Q&A boxes during the presentation, but just be patient until the end of the presentation to get those answers. Please do not let this limit your questions, as this session is about learning about the importance of recognizing and responding to people at risk in your community. Also, there will be a poll during and after this webinar. We do ask that you participate. It only takes a minute. It's very simple, yes, no, and multiple choice. Plus, it helps us and our funders determine if we are moving in the correct direction with our webinars. If you have any additional questions after the event or suggestions for other speakers, you can contact us at farmsafety@peifa.ca. We will also be providing a recorded version of this webinar at a later date, so please check our website and YouTube channel. We would love for you to share this information. For those of you just joining us now, welcome. And I'm now going to pass over the webinar to Kim Hyndman Moffat. Enjoy.
Hi, thank you, Crystal, and thank you so much to Prince Edward Island Federation of Agriculture for the invitation to come and talk about mental health and mental resiliency in this really interesting and dynamic series of webinars. I'm so happy to be a part of this and to join you here. I hope the weather has been favorable to you farmers in PEI and that you've been able to get some crops off and have some good yields and good success this year. I know here in Manitoba, we've had a rather challenging year. We weren't able to get a lot of our crops off last fall. We had an early snowfall, and so it meant that a lot of our folks were harvesting in the spring and seeding in the spring and then harvesting in the fall. So I think they're all really ready for a rest and a reprieve from it all. So like Crystal was sharing, my roots run fairly deep in the agriculture community and in rural Manitoba. And what I really appreciate about having grown up in that culture is the way that we look after each other and the way that we take care of each other when things go wrong and when a farmer is struggling. And what we do is we rally around that person. It's kind of innate in how we roll as rural people. So we organize a work bee, we send food, and we provide support to that person and to get them back up on their feet and going again. So I think that's pretty clear. We know how to do that. What sometimes we're not so sure about is how do we help somebody who's struggling with a mental health issue or mental illness. And so that's why I think it's so important to have these conversations, is to talk about ways that we can show our support, rally behind those people, know how to ask some tough questions, and to help them get back on their feet, just as we do with anybody who has maybe a physical health issue. So I'm really glad to be here and having this really important conversation. I just wanted to pop on and say a quick hello before I go off camera and show my PowerPoint presentation. But like Crystal mentioned, I'll take some questions following the presentation is over. So we all know how stressful farming can be at times when we don't have the proper growing conditions, or perhaps we have an outbreak of disease on our farm, and certainly we don't have a lot of control over the markets. Farming is one of the top 3 most stressful occupations out there. So we need to be aware that occasionally, sometimes suicide can become an option when one of our farmers feels like they've lost all hope and they don't have any sense of control in what's happening in their life. Suicide's a topic that isn't discussed as often as it needs to be. And I find that really when it is kind of front and center, it's often in following the tragic loss of a suicide in our community. And that's when we start talking about it. So again, I'm so thankful to be able to have these conversations to try to prevent that from happening. And we do that by providing tools to people to know how to talk to somebody, how to recognize that they're in trouble. So I want to first acknowledge that for many people, the topic of suicide can be a real painful one. And unlike when I'm in a room full of people and I'm having this conversation, I obviously can't see how this information is impacting and falling on the audience. So I just want to start by reminding people that over the course of the next 45 minutes, and following the webinar, just to really attend to your needs. You know, if listening to the information becomes too difficult, too challenging, it's okay to stop listening and look after yourself. Like Crystal said, this information is going to be made available on the website later, so you can always check back and watch it when you're ready. And also, I'm going to be providing a list of resources at the end as well, so you can check that out if you need to further your conversation and talk to somebody else and get some support. So just in terms of what we're going to cover in the next 45 minutes, we have an ambitious agenda, but we are going to be looking at these things. First of all, farm suicide. How big is the problem? That's important to have some context of what we're dealing with. How do we talk about suicide? What words do we use? How do we have this difficult conversation? When do we have this conversation? We're going to be looking at what are the risk factors, what puts our farming community, our farming folks at risk, and what are some of the protective factors that helps to eliminate some of those risks present for them. We're also going to look at ways that we can connect with people so that people feel safe in having what can sometimes be a difficult conversation. We're going to dispel some myths around suicide because it's always important to come at this from a fact place. So knowing what is fact and what are myths are really important. We're going to be looking at identifying warning signs. We are going to go through a 5-step approach to helping someone. We're going to look at different resources that are available locally and nationally for people. We're going to touch on the importance of caring for the caregiver. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have some time for some questions. So I'm always curious to know what brings people into these kinds of conversations. You might be here because you have a family member or a friend that you might be worried about. Perhaps you joined this conversation because, excuse me, perhaps you work in the ag industry as a frontline worker. You might be concerned about a client. Or maybe you're a farmer yourself, and like many other farmers out there, you're feeling a sense of just being really overwhelmed with the ongoing stress of running the farm, the things that are facing your industry and your ability to make a living. Whatever your background is, I think it's important that you've recognized this as an important issue, and an important conversation that we need to keep having over and over again. Today, we're looking specifically at risk for farmers, but I think the information that we're going to cover will be helpful and relevant no matter who you're trying to help. I know that this conversation is not going to make an expert out of any of us on the topic of suicide, but truthfully, in order to make a small or a big difference in someone's life, you don't have to be an expert. You really don't. You just need to care, and you need to respond in the best way that you can. And I think the old adage that says you never know the impact you can have on somebody else's life is so true. And when we can give of ourselves, with our time, our patience, our empathy, we can uplift people and move them in ways that we never thought could be possible. So what are we afraid of? Let's start with the elephant in the room, perhaps. None of us like to talk about suicide. And again, for many of us, it's a scary topic. And when we think about approaching somebody about suicide, or perhaps when they approach us, it's really normal to feel scared about asking them about suicide specifically. It's not what we do every day. It's not in our language, perhaps. And we often, when we're thinking about whether or not we should ask somebody if they're thinking about suicide, we have this, conversation in our head. And we might say things to ourselves like, well, if I ask them about suicide, I might embarrass them, or I might feel embarrassed, or I don't want to ask because, maybe now I've planted a seed. Or maybe you're afraid to ask the question because, if I ask, what if they say yes? And then how do I respond to that? I'm not sure I'm capable of responding to that. I've heard a lot of these reasons for not asking the question, and I've even experienced these feelings myself. And I think quite simply it means that we care. We don't always know how to respond. But if we're at that point where we're having this debate in our head about whether or not we should ask, there's usually a good reason. And that's because your loved one or your client or your friend is putting out some kind of risk. So you're not alone in your apprehension, right? But just knowing that, yeah, this is a question that's going to be awkward and a bit uncomfortable, that's okay. The importance of asking the question and giving someone a chance to share, it should outweigh any kind of temporary discomfort that we might have at our end. And just remember that the person that you're asking is likely feeling really nervous to talk about it. So what do we know about farm suicides? Well, we actually don't know enough about farm suicides in Canada, but we do know that in the general population in Canada, there's approximately 4,000 individuals lost to suicide every year. And because of the lack of data, we don't have a clear understanding of the extent of the problem for our farmers, because Canada doesn't code deaths with the occupation of the deceased. So there's no real way of knowing at this point. But we all know that it's happening, right? Most of us know at least one farmer who has died by suicide. In the United States, the Center for Disease Control found that male farmers are at least twice as likely to die by suicide than the general population. So it's fair to say that our rates here in Canada may be very comparable, given we share a lot of the same kind of stressors that they experience. In India, 260,000 farmers have died by suicide since they started taking statistical information in 1993. In France, currently, a farmer takes their life every other day. And in the UK, more than one farmer per week will take their life. So these are sobering stats, and it's clear that there's something about the kind of work we're doing and the culture of farming that is placing our folks at risk. Before we go too far into our conversation, I think it's important to share a little bit of information about the power of using, as best we can, non-stigmatizing language when we talk about the issue of suicide. We know that the way that we talk about mental illness and the way we talk about suicide, it can either add to the shame and the stigma experienced by folks, or it can make it more comfortable for people to talk about their struggles. So here's a few tips just to keep in mind. As much as we can, avoid labeling terms like calling someone crazy or mental, and instead talking about a person's mental health or a mental illness. Died by suicide versus committed suicide. We all hear that language, committed suicide. It's been around for a long time. And I used to run a suicide bereavement support group for 12 or 13 years, for many, many years. And a lot of the folks that came through those doors had lost someone to suicide. And that term committed suicide to them was very stigmatizing and very, very shaming, because the word committed is often associated with a criminal act or a sin. And actually up to 1970 in Canada, it was considered a criminal act, and it was punishable by anybody who had made an attempt, a suicide attempt. So today, you know, where we understand that we need to care for people and not punish them. And that is the way to bring about hope and recovery for people. So instead of saying committed suicide, a better way to refer to it is to either say, you know, the person died by suicide or they took their life. And finally, it's important to not refer to someone's attempt to end their life as a failed attempt or a successful attempt or a completed attempt. And attempt survivors, you know, most often already have a poor sense of self-esteem. And when we refer to an attempt as a failure, you know, we can add to that already kind of diminished sense of self. And nor do we want to refer to an attempt, you know, as a success, because this can imply that the death was somehow an achievement of some kind or something positive, even though it will have, you know, very tragic consequences. So we need to understand a little bit more about suicide. There's a lot of misinformation, a lot of secrecy around the issue still. So let's start by looking at what's going on for people who are experiencing thoughts of suicide and seeing this as an option. Well, suicide is really about the internalized emotional pain. It's the pain that we have inside. And a farmer's risk is going to increase when they can't see a way out of their problems. When we experience a crisis of some kind, one of the first things that we do is we usually, you know, go to our usual go-to ways of coping. And we try those things. And when none of those things are working, we start to feel a sense of dread, and our anxiety starts to increase. And eventually, you know, if we're not able to get a handle on it and be able to cope effectively, we start to become overwhelmed with the situation. And this increases their sense of helplessness and hopelessness when they can't get on top of this. We know that suicide affects all of us. We all know here in this webinar that life can be really challenging. We are in a very challenging time right now with COVID overlaying all of the already pre-existing stresses that we have in our life right now. Many of you here today may have had thoughts of suicide. Some of you may have attempted suicide, or, you know, some of you may have known somebody who has died by suicide. It affects all of us. When a farmer in our community, somebody that we know, takes his or her own life, there's a very large hole left, and we will feel the impact some way. Studies show that when one person dies by suicide, there's at least 10 people who are directly and profoundly impacted by the loss. So it's so important that we're talking openly and often about this issue to help reduce that stigma. And when we can reduce the stigma, we make it easier for people to come forth and say, hey, you know, I'm struggling, I'm not doing okay. And we can then reduce the number of lives lost. So let's talk about some of the myths out there. There's a lot of myths. We're just going to cover a few here. The first one, if people are talking about suicide, they won't do it. And actually, a study showed that as many as 85% of people who die by suicide had actually communicated their plan or their intent to at least one person the week prior to their death. So we need to take it seriously when somebody says something to us that sounds like a cry for help or a suicide threat. You know, this study shows that there's a big opportunity there. If people are talking about it before they act, then we can change the trajectory, hopefully, so that they're able to get some help and some support. If you ask someone if they're thinking about suicide, I might be giving them the idea, and this is such a common myth out there, and that is not the case. When we ask someone that question, it actually gives people the permission that they're looking for to talk honestly about this deep, dark secret that they've been carrying around, and it can provide them, with a lot of relief to be able to share that. And asking that difficult question, it shows that you care enough to ask. Once at risk, always at risk. That too is a myth. For a very small number of people with a mental illness, for some folks, they may have suicide ideation throughout their lifetime, but that is a small number of folks. For most people, we can move in, we can move out, and we can move through our thoughts of suicide. And just because you're experiencing these intense thoughts of suicide today, it doesn't mean that they'll be present there tomorrow or present there tomorrow in the same way. They can shift, they can intensify, and they can lessen at various points throughout our life. People who die by suicide are selfish and took the easy way out. We've all heard that one too. And often when people are at the point of taking their life, many feel like they've become a burden to their family and friends, and they truthfully, they don't want to be that, right? And sadly, they often believe that if I end my life, I'm going to be doing my family a favor. The belief that people are taking the easy way out, it just doesn't equate with the suffering that takes place for a person before they make that decision. Many people will think about the decision for months or even years before acting. So when we're considering a farmer's risk for suicide, we need to consider both their risks and what are the protective factors that are going to help reduce that risk for suicide. So why are farmers at such high risk for suicide? Well, they spend a lot of time working in isolation, right? So not like an office job or a factory job where you...
road out of pallets.
Sorry, I'm hearing some feedback here.
Saw that the other day.
I'm wondering if somebody has their mute off. Okay, maybe we're okay there. Farmers spend a lot of time by themselves, and generally farmers, enjoy that aspect of the farm when they get to spend a lot of time out in the field. But when their mental health is starting to languish, a sense of alienation can start to take over, and that isolation can become a real challenge. Financial stress. Farmers are often worried about their financial health of their business. Margins are always tight, and the financial bottom lines are so tied to so many of those uncontrollable factors like Mother Nature and market prices and disease and political decisions here at home and geopolitics. So there's a lot of forces at play that impact our bottom line. And low help-seeking behaviors. I want to be careful not to generalize too much here, but I think it's safe to say that, in the culture of farming, we've made it more challenging for people to ask for help when they need it. It's interesting because what makes farmers so successful is their strong work ethic, right? Their strong sense of independence and determination to kind of push through those hard times. But these qualities can work against them if they then see themselves as the only person who can fix their problem. Farmers obviously have access to dangerous equipment. They have access to lethal means by which they can use to take their life. I've talked to several farmers who have planned to stage their death so it will look like an accident. We know that most farmers have immediate access to guns, and guns, are the most lethal means out there for taking one's life. Rural people are generally more disadvantaged in terms of community resources. They may not have the finances to pay for a counselor. Perhaps they're too busy to leave the farm. They can't get away because of chores. They can't afford to drive 3 hours to get a counselor. Or they may not want to talk to somebody who doesn't have a good and thorough understanding of what rural life and rural farm culture is all about. And finally, stigma of reaching out still prevents a lot of people from getting help. They may fear being labeled and treated differently. And thankfully, this is really starting to change. And this is the most hopeful part I find, is that more and more people are talking openly because of mental health campaigns, and just it's a more open climate to talk about our struggles. So all of these things can impact a farmer's ability to cope and may give rise to thoughts of suicide. So simply speaking, we're going to look at protective factors here now. When we have more protective factors than we do risk factors, then our risk of suicide is going to decrease. And protective factors are those things that we have in our life, that exist in our life, that contribute to us feeling really, having a good sense of positive mental health. They help us to cope with the day-to-day stress. And they're going to look different for everybody. So, they might include things like woodworking, gardening, playing hockey, exercise. There could be a million different things. Having meaningful relationships with people who are you found to be supportive and care about us. Those folks give us our foundation to go out into the world. It could be friends. You might have a partner, people in your community, or maybe you have a therapist on your list for support. Having something that gives you meaning and gives you purpose can help reduce your risk for suicide. So for a lot of folks, certainly a lot of folks that I've talked to, having a pet or having livestock, right? That gives you a reason to get up in the morning. For other people, it might be children, might be grandchildren, might be a strong sense of faith in a higher power. Problem-solving skills. If you have some problem-solving skills, those things kind of help you reduce your risk if you are more open and willing to try new ideas. An open and willingness to seek out help. So having good help-seeking behavior is a huge protective factor. None of us can get through this life unassisted. So asking for help, and this is the biggest message we keep putting out there, asking for help is not a sign of personal weakness, but a sign of strength. And so we are trying to make the climate much more friendly, inviting for people to talk openly about their struggles. And if we put the effort into looking after our physical and our mental health, often we can prevent ourselves from going into crisis. Not always, but many times we can if we're taking good care of ourselves. So when we're speaking with someone who's struggling with their mental health, we're listening and we're asking for both the stressors and the coping skills that are available to that person. And in order for a person to feel safe in confiding with us, whether you're talking to a friend or you're talking to a client, we need to find a way to connect with that person first. So how do we do that? If we can approach the person using kindness and empathy, that's a good place to start. People feel more safe and they're more likely to answer questions and be honest about their feelings. Giving people the time and attention shows you care. So it's a little thing like putting your cell phone away. It just shows that, hey, I'm here, I'm listening, you've got my attention. And really, it can be helpful to let people know that they're not alone. When I worked for the Manitoba Farm and Rural Stress Line, I would have farmers often ask me things like, are other people that are calling this line, are they going through the same thing or something like this? Or they'd say something like, I don't suppose you've heard anything kind of crazy like this before. And I think what they're really needing to hear from me is, you're not alone, I had a conversation earlier with a guy who was saying something really similar. There's other people that are going through, something that looks a lot like what you're going through. And it can be really helpful to know that their reactions and their feelings and their behaviors are shared by other people. So some of you may be familiar with Brent Brown. She's a researcher. She studies human connection and vulnerability, and she outlines the 4 steps to connection. So just briefly, trying to see the situation from the other person's perspective and try to imagine what it is that they're experiencing. As best we can, we want to stay out of the way of judging what they're going through. We know people's lives are complicated, our own lives are complicated, and we don't know all the parts of the story. And really, we don't need to know the whole story, and we don't need to disagree or agree or even have an opinion. An effective listener doesn't have to pick a side. We need to be there to listen and support. Listen for the emotion behind the story. What is it that they're feeling? We hear the words, but what are they feeling? Okay, this person's feeling sad, or maybe this person's feeling scared, and then reflect it back to them. It sounds like you're really worried about your daughter. That makes sense. And then finally, communicating that you've heard and understood. And we can do that by summarizing and highlighting what we've heard. So then it gives a person a chance to say, yeah, that's exactly what I mean. Or no, I didn't mean that. This is what I meant to say. I like the quote at the bottom: rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection. And so, we remember how we feel when we're with somebody. So if you're worried that you didn't say, the exact right thing, or maybe use language that wasn't the best, just remember that people remember how you made them feel. If we feel cared for, if we feel like somebody understood us in that moment, that's really important, more important than having, a sentence phrased in the proper way. Some helpful responses. So ways that you can respond to somebody's pain, because often we don't know what to say when somebody's sharing something really personal. Sometimes we feel uncomfortable with that. We don't know how to respond, but we can share our concern for the person and let them know that we're going to do our best to try to help them. We're not experts, but we can care and we can be there. Look for ways that you can normalize and that you can validate their feelings and their thoughts. Avoiding, if you can, try to avoid minimizing their pain by saying things like, and we've all done this, I've done this too, at least your crop was only 50% write-off. Or maybe, saying after someone lost their mother, well, at least she didn't suffer like other people do. And we're all well-intentioned when we say these things, but it often can give the message that you don't have the right to the suffering or the concern that you have. And ensuring that you're allowing the person to have as much control over the decisions as is safe to do so. So if you have immediate concerns for their safety or the safety of others, maybe they're making threats towards other people, obviously we can't not act. We have to do something. But for the most part, people are capable of working through their choices on their own, and they're going to feel better afterwards for doing that if they have some control over the decisions in front of them. So what are we listening for that would signal to us that this person that we're talking to may be at risk for suicide, and suicide's become an option for them? People may say things or they may act in ways that are concerning. If they're threatening to take their life, most often it comes in the form of an indirect kind of threat. So they'll say something like, I don't want to wake up tomorrow, or they're going to miss me when I'm gone. And it's really important to ask for clarity if they are vague, and say something like, Kathy, are you talking about suicide here? Because you need to know. Sometimes the threat is more direct, and they'll just come out and say, I'm going to kill myself, or I think I'm going to kill myself if that loan doesn't go through on Saturday. So direct threats are obviously more clear and expresses a person's intention of what they're thinking and what they're going to do. Sometimes we don't hear a person's pain, but we can see it through behavioral changes. And so to be clear, just because someone's having one or two of these changes that we're going to go through, it doesn't mean necessarily that they're going to kill themselves. We need to see the changes in a broader context. For instance, someone might be drawing up a will, or maybe giving things away. That doesn't mean that they're planning to take their life. They're just trying to be proactive and get on top of some things. It's when we see several of these things and there's losses perhaps in their life or significant stressors in that person's life, then there's more cause for concern. So we may see things like somebody using alcohol or drugs more often. We might see people giving away valuables arranging for funeral plans, wills. Somebody might be stockpiling their medication, or perhaps recently purchased a gun. They're acquiring the means to follow through. Multiple attempts in the past or a recent attempt may be an indicator this person, is really wanting to die. Withdrawing from family and friends, and we see that one fairly often with folks. They start to withdraw from friends, family, activities, and their world starts to get smaller and smaller. So that's an important one to pay attention to. A person may be crying often. One that I left out of here, but anger is also another one that you may see. Somebody who is increasingly angry. Some people will engage in self-harm behaviors such as cutting, maybe withholding food or water from themselves. That may be a sign. Low energy, just not able to get out of bed in the morning, don't have motivation. Change in sleep patterns, also very common. So you may see the person sleeping a lot during the day, or they're up all night, right? So some real changes in their ability to get a good night rest. And then risk-taking behavior is often one we see too. So maybe they're driving at high speeds at times. Maybe they've received a DUI and now they're coming into conflict with the law. So those are some of the kinds of cues that are out there. In terms of moods, the closer somebody gets to actually making an attempt, the more they become filled with that sense of despair and rejection. The anxiety continues to increase. People may often feel very flat. They don't feel like they have any joy or happiness, and they often describe their world looking as very gray. Something to be mindful of, and you may be aware of this, but if a person that you're concerned about suddenly appears to be happy after a prolonged period of depression, it may be because they've decided to take their life and they're no longer in that painful back and forth struggle to make that choice. Many of us have heard following a death by suicide comments like, they seem to be doing so much better. And so we need to check that out. What is the reason for a positive mood change? Our thinking is often not rooted in reality when we're hurting so much. And we may truly believe that the people in our lives would be better off without us, like I said earlier. We may see ourselves as weak and ineffective, and we get really stuck in this helpless and hopeless place. So, changing gears a little bit, here's where we can make a difference. Okay, lots of different models of suicide prevention out there. And I'd like to encourage anybody who wants more information to consider taking some of the trainings that I'm going to list at the end of the webinar today, because we're just really scratching the surface here. But I chose a simple 5-step model put out by the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention. So basically we need to ask whether or not they're thinking about suicide. We need to be able to keep them safe. We need to be there. We need to help them connect. And it's really great if we can follow up. So before I go through the next steps, I'd just like to say, in any situation when you're not sure how to act, how to support someone, it's always a great option to call your local crisis line or your local suicide line. You don't need to be alone in this decision. There's people out there who can help you kind of determine, excuse me, the right course of action based on the particular circumstances. So ask, are you thinking about suicide? Unless the person has made an indirect or direct threat, we don't know if the person's at risk. So we have to just be brave and ask the question. Joe, I'm really worried about what you're saying. Are you thinking about suicide? Another nice way of asking is to normalize the presence of suicidal thoughts during hard times. So a good example would be, Joe, when I talk to guys who aren't able to get their bills paid and worried about losing the farm, they sometimes start to think about suicide. Is that something that's coming up for you? So just normalizing before asking, it shows an understanding of the pain that the person's going through. Yeah, I would suggest one thing, that try to avoid asking the question this way. So you're not thinking about suicide, are you? this can give the person the message that you're not really comfortable hearing if the answer is yes. I mean, it's better to ask that question than to not ask the question at all. There's just better ways of approaching the question. So no matter if the answer is yes or no to the question, it's been my own personal experience that people appreciate the fact that you care enough. You care enough to ask a difficult question, and remember that you're asking that question out of concern and because you're seeing some warning signs. Okay, so if the answer is yes, we have a few more important questions to ask. Do they have a plan in mind? What is the plan? Do they have what they need to carry out the plan? Perhaps they're thinking of using a gun or hanging themselves or having a car crash. Do they have access to those things? And the more detailed the plan, the more they have considered this to be an option, and the more seriously we need to take the threat. And can they stay safe? You know, if they're having thoughts of suicide, but they don't have a plan or a timeline, but the thoughts are there. Can you stay safe after we have this conversation? Are you going to be okay if you go home after this? Keep them safe and be there. We want to ask if they can remove any means they have from their possession until they're feeling better. So restricting means is a really effective suicide prevention strategies in a lot of situations. Ask them if they can leave their gun at a friend's house, for example. You want to help them come up with some kind of a safety plan, but the safety plan has to be doable and it has to be realistic. That's really important. If they do have a plan, they know what they're going to do, and they have access to the means, and they intend to act on the plan immediately, our role becomes pretty clear at that point. We need to ensure that they're going to get the help they need right away. So you want to either take them to the local hospital or somebody in their circle, take them to the local hospital. And if they refuse, you should be contacting 911 for police to come and do a safety check on that person. And depending on the circumstances, if you know the family members, it may be important to notify them of the risk as well. And again, there may be circumstances where that might not be appropriate, but it may be something you want to include. However, if the person's having thoughts of suicide, but they don't have a plan, or they don't have an immediate intent to die, no time frame, there's a real opportunity to help that person just by giving them time to share their feelings, to listen, to validate their experience. You might want to see if they'd be open to connecting with some of the resources that I'm going to share here soon, or a trusted friend that they might have. We need to take their feelings seriously, even though they're maybe just having thoughts of suicide at this point. Because remember that things can get worse for people, and they may go from having thoughts to actually kind of planning. So we need to be mindful of that. And we want to help them to connect. One of the great services that the Canadian Suicide Prevention Line has is their ability to call out to people that have been identified as somebody at risk. So let's say you have a client, you've delivered some bad news to them, they've stormed out, but not before they tell you that, you know, they're going to kill themselves, and you're not quite sure what to do. You can call the Canada Suicide Prevention Line, and they can help give you some direction or some guidance, and you can run the scenario past them. And they can also offer to place a call out to that person and, you know, let them know that, you know, I was talking with Bill at the bank. He said you had a really difficult day. I'm just calling to check in and see how you're doing. And then the responder at the suicide line can assess for suicide. As a natural helper, you can share a resource with the person. So whether it's community mental health or an addiction center in your area, or a support group, just giving people information can be very empowering. And, you know, we're not trained to deal with a lot of these kinds of specific mental health issues, but we can do our part by connecting them to the people that can help. Let's see here. In my years, when I worked for the Manitoba Farm and Rural Stress Line and with the Canadian Suicide Line, I've had a lot of conversations with people who are calling and they're talking about, somebody that they're very concerned about. And that person might even be just sitting right beside them in the chair. And, the helper will then pass the phone over to the person of concern. And then they can have a conversation with the responder at the suicide line. So a nice warm handoff can work sometimes too. And depending on the relationship that you have to the person, you may offer to go with them. If they make an appointment, let's say with a community mental health worker and they're nervous, you might extend your time and say, you know what, I can go with you if that would be helpful. And if you're comfortable with that. So follow up, important to let the person at risk know that you're really glad that you shared their story with you. People can get an enormous sense of relief about talking about their struggles and their thoughts of suicide. But, having said that too, sometimes people will feel really vulnerable and maybe a little embarrassed after they've disclosed something to somebody else. And they might then kind of have second thoughts maybe, and they might be worried that, should I trust that other person with this information? It's always nice to follow up the next day or shortly afterwards, just to see how that person's doing and to see if they're using their safety plan. And this can make the person feel that they were really cared for and that they mattered. So briefly, there's lots of resources out there for people to access, and it's up to you who you turn to, where your comfort level is. It may be a friend, a family member, coworker, community member. A lot of people start, with their family doctor, especially if they're having concerns about their own mental health. They can talk about treatment options and they can talk about local resources in your community. There's the Canadian Suicide Prevention Services where I work, and there's a toll-free number. It's for anybody across Canada. It's open 24/7, 365 days a year. They also have a texting program there, which I'll note is only open from 4 p.m. till midnight. That's Eastern time. The Do More Ag Foundation, they have a lot of great resources on their website for counseling services and information. So there's their link. In PEI, you have the Island Helpline, which is your local crisis line. And thankfully, they're open 24/7, confidential. There's their toll-free number there. And thankfully for you folks in PEI, we certainly don't have this in Manitoba, but you have access to a farmer's assistance program, which is confidential. And there's the number there that you can reach out to get connected. I understand you can have access to 6 counseling sessions for yourself and for your family and for your employees. And that's for people who are members of the Federation or the National Farmers Union. And just very briefly, I just learned of a couple of other resources that I didn't get put on the slide, but if you're curious to know about what are the, I don't even know where to start in accessing resources. If you want to call PEI 211, they have a list of all kinds of resources around community resources, social services, and government services. So if you were looking for maybe low cost or no cost counseling, give 211 a call and they can help you with that information. The other thing I just recently learned was that in PEI, in the new year, you're going to have 3 new mobile crisis unit teams that are going to be in operation and activated, and there's going to be a mental health worker paired up with a plainclothes police officer. So if somebody is having a mental health crisis, they can access that service, which is really, really wonderful. And I think you can access that, the article I read, you can access it by calling 911 or a toll-free number, which was not in the article. So I think that's yet to be determined. So the resources are out there. Just a few different resources for more information on learning more about suicide prevention. Safe Talk is a 4-hour workshop. Assist is a 2-day long workshop for recognizing people at risk, helping them to connect, and also helping to safety plan, more extensive than the Safe Talk. Do More Ag has recently put out a Talk, Ask, Listen series. They're partnering with FCC, And it's specific for the farming community. So there's their link. You can access their fund for your community and maybe book a workshop. And then I wanted to plug In the Know, which is a new mental health literacy program for the agriculture community. It's 4 hours, and they're rolling it out through Ontario right now and possibly Manitoba in the future. So it's based on the research that Andrea Jones-Bitten did at the University of Guelph, looking at farm stress. And so she interviewed 1,100 farmers. And so this program was designed based on that evidence-based material. So briefly, I know we're running close to the hour here. If you've been in the role of supporting another person with their mental health struggles, addictions, concerns for suicide, you know that it can affect your own sense of well-being and happiness. And this is something that we all have to work on. I have a daughter who has mental illness, and I know that I need to stop, or I need to really pay attention to my own mental health and well-being, because we can get really pulled in and triggered, and sometimes we respond in really emotional ways, and sometimes we feel like we're not doing enough or the right thing. So we need to really give ourselves permission to take care of ourselves. We need to do that in order to help other people. So hopefully you can take the time to find some activities that bring you joy, people that you can connect with that raise your spirits, and just know that you're not alone in your efforts in trying to support somebody in your circle. Reach out when you need to. It will lessen the burden and the load that you carry when you share it with others. So that's all the information I have for today. In closing, I just want to say that I hope that what we covered was helpful and something that you'll consider when you find yourself in a helping role. And really important to remember that the ultimate decisions of others are not in our control, but we can do our very best to be supportive, to listen, to provide information, and to be advocates. And that can be that can make a really big difference in somebody's life when somebody is struggling. So thank you for joining us and for caring. And Crystal, if there's any questions out there, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
All right, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to give Kim a moment to have a drink of water and take a bit of a break, because that's quite a little marathon session she went on. I learned a lot. I hope you fellas did as well. Hopefully you can see on your screen right now our poll. It's a very, very quick, very simple poll to do. If you could, excuse me, please take the time to answer that. It helps us to be able to better plan, how we can move forward in the future to be able to continue to provide webinars of this caliber that can help out. We're, now living in a very different world. Originally, this whole series was going to be a traditional type one where everybody is together in large groups, and of course the life has changed considerably. And I think this has turned out to be a good alternative. But if you could just fill in the polls and help us out, that would be absolutely wonderful. And also, please feel free to ask some questions. While you're filling that out, I'm going to ask him a couple, and maybe that'll help get the ball rolling. So, Kim, when you were talking about there's 10 people affected by each and every suicide, so that's outside the family members, that's the community that you're looking at when you use those numbers?
That could be community, it could be family, could be friends, but it's 10 people who have been identified that are profoundly impacted by that loss. So it doesn't kind of quantify who those people are, but just that's that there's a minimum 10 people who are going to be greatly impacted. And those folks, I think it's so important, because I used to say when I ran the Suicide Bereavement Group that this isn't just postvention. These people sitting here talking about their grief and sadness and loss, we're actually preventing those folks from being at risk for suicide too, because sometimes they are at risk. So it's really important to provide those services to people who have lost somebody. And to know that there's resources in the community, suicide bereavement support groups, going online. There's a community online, so good information out there. And again, to know you're not alone.
Good, good, good. For people who, I'm going to try and ask this as delicately as possible, but for people who know they're having issues with their mental health and they're struggling to find someone to help them, and you did a great job of providing suggestions for places that you can go and talk to, but if you're realizing that you're not getting the help you think you need, or the attention that you need to be able to deal with your issues, how would you suggest people move forward with that?
Yeah, you know, and that's so true. And I think that's so hard when you're in a place where you're not feeling well, and maybe you've been brave and you've opened up to somebody and you didn't get the response that you needed, right? And I think sometimes we're tempted to give up. My hope is that people, and perhaps I'm a bit biased, but I think there's a lot of legitimacy to calling the local crisis line, right? It's free, it's confidential. The people that work on those lines, they're not there to judge. They're there to listen. They're there to support. They're there to hear, you know, what have you tried? What's worked? What hasn't worked? What do you think you need? What are people not understanding about what you need? And to kind of tease that out with the person. And then, you know, in partnership with that person answering the phone, let's look at a plan. What can we try next, right? And to kind of engage that person in thinking about doing something different, because what they've been trying to do hasn't quite worked yet, and that's not maybe the fault of that person. They just haven't found the right person or the right resource. So it's really hard to do when you're struggling, but to know if you can just keep trying to find somebody else who will get your story, who will get it, and you know, you've got that connection, then that can be a pretty powerful thing.
And I think you bring up a very valid point there about finding the right person to deal with you. It's just my own feeling is that you shouldn't ever feel like you're being difficult, but having the right person to discuss and talk to about what your issues are should never be a reason for you to stop moving forward and trying to connect and get help if you're in a bad place.
Absolutely. You know, it's the same, you know, we say that if you go to a doctor and you don't have a good connection, or you don't feel like you're being heard or understood, you know, we say, well, maybe you should get a second opinion. Same thing applies if you go to a mental health practitioner or a therapist, and you know what, they just don't seem to kind of get it. They don't understand farming, or they don't seem to really be listening to what I'm saying. Then, you know, it's well within your right to go elsewhere and to look somewhere else. Absolutely. But don't give up. That's the message. Don't stop. Don't give up.
I love that. I love that. So does anyone else have some questions or help that they would like to ask Kim for? This is the lady to talk to. She's been a crisis counselor for many, many years. And I think this is the time to ask of some help if you can take the chance. I'm going to shut down the polling. Thank you ever so much for helping and filling that out. And I'm going to be quiet and let you ask a few questions if you'd like. It seems really, really quiet. Wow. I'm going to take that as you providing us with superior information, Kim. I want to thank everybody for attending and paying attention. Excuse me, goodness. I want to thank Kim for coming forward and doing this. It's a difficult topic that really needs to be addressed, and I thank everyone for coming and watching. Once again, if you like this session, if you enjoyed it, if you have any suggestions for other speakers, please contact us. You can email me at farmsafety@peifa.ca, and we'd love to hear from you. I really hope you enjoyed yourselves, and stay healthy, stay safe, and take care of yourselves.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.